Colleagues, good evening. It's 7 o'clock. So with everyone's permission, as I can see people are streaming in, we will start giving a start to this conversation. I don't know if the rest of you have noticed, but London is decidedly warm, pleasantly warm. And it's got this hope through the weather in what's expected to be a blustery, cold, damp time of the year, when it feels awesome outside. Very similar to the hope that's pinned on primary care within the tsunami of change that is happening in the NHS at this point. All the talk about waiting lists, pressures, financial pressures, changes, modernization, transformation, improvements. Primary care stands tall. Good evening, folks. This is the Future of Primary Care webinar. I am Mohit Venkatram, your host for the evening and the Deputy Chief Executive for North East London Foundation Trust. North East London Foundation Trust provides services in Waltham Forest, Redbridge, Barking and Dagenham, Havering, all the way towards Mid and South Essex and Kent and Dover. So you can imagine we are an amazingly huge trust. And we have the privilege of working with some fabulous, fabulous primary care partners who are so dedicated, who are so compassionate, who are so kind and so focused on delivering the right outcomes, that it got us thinking, if we could use some of our large resources to jointly create spaces where we can learn together, develop together, become stronger together, and consequently provide some amazing services to our residents, wouldn't that be wonderful? From that thought was born this webinar, where we host a conversation about primary care on a monthly basis with an expert with eminence and prominence in the field of what they have done in primary care. Today morning, I spent most of the day in an acute hospital. It's our local acute hospital. My mother had a rather important procedure she had to go through. I came across nothing, absolutely nothing, but kindness, compassion, and expertise from everyone I met. The doctors, the nurses, the therapists, the ward boys, the cleaners, the people who came to check on whether you want a sandwich. Everyone owes that compassion and kindness in such a way that you sat back in amazement to think how wonderful to be served by the NHS acute hospitals in this way. But that did get me thinking, if we could free up hospitals so that they only had to care for people who genuinely needed secondary care services, genuinely had complex problems, and could provide care for the others outside, wouldn't that be exactly the kind of care everyone would receive, not just my mother? Because I came back bowled over from that secondary care experience today from our local hospital. So what could we do together so that we could provide the same compassionate, kind, but expertise in our community and primary care services? Could we reimagine a different future that will give our local residents the ability to smile, be cared for, be treated, but live lives that allow them to achieve their fullest potential? Having spoken highly of secondary care services and how wonderful the experience was today, it's important to reflect on what primary care has delivered in the last period that's been published. In the month of August alone, in a country with a population of about 60 million people, 28 million appointments were delivered by primary care in 1 month. Literally, every second person has had contact with primary care in the last month. 65% of these appointments were face-to-face appointments. 45% of these appointments, so nearly half, just a tad under, were seen by GPs themselves. This is in a country where we often talk about the reducing number of GP sessions available. Does that not make us sit back and think in awe? How fortunate to have these amazing people working in primary care, in secondary care, caring for us. And that got me to think, would the sum of the parts not be much greater than each of the parts themselves? So what could we do in such a way that we worked in harmony? We could genuinely reimagine a reset where agnostic of organizations, where agnostic of who is required to provide what care, we actually reimagined care for all the people who could be provided non-complex, compassionate, kind, but technical expertise in primary and community services rather than in secondary care. Would that not allow us jointly to provide much better services for our residents? Would that not allow many of us not to spend days sitting in a hospital for an appointment or for an admission, but actually get care when needed, at the time needed, in a way that's needed, but around our lives? There are many places in the country that are reimagining this future, that are thinking of a reset, that are thinking, is there a possibility of reimagining what could be provided in primary care and relooking at what genuinely needs to go to secondary care? One such leader who is leading this work, who is making a phenomenal difference, who has already put not just the seeds and the strategy, but some actual concrete difference in the ground, is Debbie Sorkins, our guest today. And it is my absolute privilege to have someone like her on our webinar, talking to us about her experiences. Debbie has an absolutely amazingly illustrious career when I was looking at it. I mean, she's one of those people who has served on so many boards with such width of experience that just having her with that background gives us the opportunity to reimagine what community and primary care could look like. Debbie has been a board member of the Richmond Fellowship, the Voluntary and Community Sector Partnership, East Place, People Can, Camden Society, Papworth Trust. And what's phenomenal is in many of these, she's been either a vice chair or a chair as well. And it's really, really phenomenal to see someone with that leadership experience come to us today and talk to us. Debbie's also been the chief executive of the National Skills Academy of Social Care and is now the National Director of System Leadership at the Leadership Center. With such an illustrious career spanning across so many sectors, I'm so incredibly grateful to be welcoming Debbie to our webinar today. But colleagues, before I hand over to Debbie, a quick reminder. We have over 300 people registered for this webinar on many platforms. So please use the Q&A function on the Zoom link if you want to post a question. I will pull out themes from those questions and then create the places for Debbie to share her views on that. Many colleagues have already emailed me their questions. Please be assured I will pick that up as we go through in our conversations with Debbie. So without further ado, let me welcome Debbie and hand over to her so she can share with us her experience and her views on where the future of primary care lies. Debbie, welcome to the webinar, and it is so wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mohit. Rather than saying so many sectors, I thought for one moment you were going to say so many decades, which would also be true. Good evening, everybody. Mohit, many thanks for that wonderful introduction. I do hope I can live up to the billing. I work at a place, as Mohit has said, called the Leadership Centre. Just by brief introduction, the Leadership Centre is a charity. It's been going for 20 years. We had our birthday party last week, and we were set up by local government, by the Local Government Association and the then Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. And we still work with local government, with local authorities, and especially with public health. But over that 20 years, the remit has broadened. So we now also work with the NHS in various guises. So it might be with acute or community trusts or with primary care. And primary care, especially as it looks to navigate a way through and find its voice in integrated care systems and on integrated care boards. But the remit is always the same for the centre. How can we strengthen people's capacity to work in complex and gnarly and difficult environments? Or if you're finding it particularly hard to get traction, you feel like other people have power, you're not sure how decisions are getting made or who's making them, but you're pretty certain it's not you. Where you're having to balance the long and the short term. And I think this is a real issue for primary care. You know you want to help your communities and that some of these changes will take time. At the same time, you're being badgered for, can you see more people? Can you see them now? When you're having to deal with churn in places and fatigue, which I think is still under discussed in health generally. And when you're working in what I call political or politicised environments, political if you're working with councillors or MPs, politicised environments are how I would describe the NHS, an institution acutely attuned to changes in the political wind. So to this evening, if it's okay with you, I will share my screen and hopefully this will work. Wonderful, fantastic. Love it when this happens. When I was looking back at what earlier speakers had discussed, they had, I noticed, in some cases focused on the what. So I was looking at Dr. Lucy Martin, spoke in May on vertical integration in Dudley. I think this evening is going to be more about the how you create conditions to make change happen, and the kinds of change that Mohit has described as an aspiration that we all want. Do so with particular reference to some of the staples of adaptive or systems leadership. So the importance of relationships, trust, and what it can lead to and what happens when it's not there. Purpose and influence when you don't have positional power or think you don't. So we'll start with a little bit about the context we're working in, what it means to lead in complexity, because that sets the scene for why we need to work differently. Then we'll look at how we can do so, key approaches and some tools for your armoury that you can just take away and try out. We'll bring in examples from around the country and especially some more recent work in Devon. But the thing I would like to stress is that fundamentally, this is about your leadership role. In May, Dr. Martin talked about people in leadership roles as being, and I love this phrase, ordinary folk getting on with the job. And this is exactly it. You don't need to be extraordinary. In fact, the more ordinary you are, the better, because leadership and systems leadership is for everyone. So, little bit about the context. Let's bring this up. Mohit talked about a tsunami earlier, and to me it really feels like primary care is in the eye of the storm here. It's not just that the number of fully qualified permanent GPs has fallen back in recent years. despite increases in demand. I was looking at some BBC analysis from last month of NHS England figures, and actually the average GP in England now has to care for almost 20% more patients than 9 years ago. At the same time, the recent Darcy review, amongst others, has been stark about the level of challenges that we are facing at the moment. I won't go through everything on this page. You can read them, and I'm sure many of these issues will be familiar to you. But I chose them because actually whether they are directly concerned with primary care or whether they relate to the wider determinants of health, it feels to me that they are likely to end up at the door of primary care. If you want to do something about inequalities or deprivation in your locality, then having most schools now providing food parcels or food bank support, having many children now in relative poverty is going to come back and influence your ability to do that. And many of these issues were playing out in Devon, where I worked with colleagues earlier in the year, two colleagues, one called John Wilderspin and the other called Tim Whitworth. We were working with two distinct but linked groups. So first of all, members of a nascent primary care collaborative board made up of GPs and managers from 4 different locality boards. And for this purpose, Plymouth was part of the Western locality. If there is anybody from Plymouth here today, please don't at me about this. It's just how they acted. They also had representatives from community pharmacy as well. In other words, these were ordinary people, ordinary folk who had volunteered to step up and put their heads above the parapet. So on the one hand, we were working with the board. On the other, we were working with GPs, clinical directors, primary care network managers and pharmacists from across all the localities. All the localities, I have to say, saw themselves as different and worse off than every other locality. But taken in the round, they all faced a combination of interwoven issues. They included acute trusts in deficit, an ICB overall in significant deficit, a lot of churn of personnel. So you had the chair of the ICB, for example, Sarah Wollaston, the former MP, standing down almost in protest at the additional cuts to ICBs. You had other executive staff going, there has been real churn there, and it's made it very hard for primary care to get a real grip at an ICB level, because who do you engage with? More broadly, Devon, as many other places, is seeing an increasingly ageing population, and really the dial on healthy life expectancy, according to the Director of Public Health, has not really moved over the past decade. And the system as a whole is facing numerous challenges, some common to lots of places, for example, like mental health issues and mental health access. Others more distinctive to Devon, so particular patterns of rural and coastal and urban deprivation. And primary care in Devon was coming up against all these challenges, alongside increasing demand, cost inflation, and recruitment and retention, both in general practice and in pharmacy. As elsewhere, resourcing hadn't increased at the same rate as the rest of the NHS. You saw GPs retiring or leaving the profession and pharmacies struggling or closing. And this was having a real impact on local, especially rural communities, on morale in primary care and on demand in the acute sector. And it struck me that the kinds of challenges that primary care was facing through this really was specific to both primary care and to the rest of the country for 2 reasons. First of all, if you are in primary care, you are likely to be working in complexity. Now, complexity has a specific meaning. in this context. There is the line, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I happen to think this is a particularly useful way of looking at the world. It's not my model. It belongs to a man called Dave Snowden. It's called the Cynefin model. The basic idea is that in a complex situation, where you're dealing with deep-seated, multifaceted issues that have been around a long time, not many levers to pull, lots and lots of people to bring together. In these kinds of situations, you won't have cause and effect. You can't rely on things happening. There's no predictability there. So just saying we're going to spend X amount of money on something, or we're going to run the service in this way, you might get what you're looking for. It all might be a bit meh. You might get something completely different, or you might get nothing at all. You will only know after the event. And by the way, when I say you, I mean you and everyone in your teams. Complexity is no respecter of seniority. You can be absolutely on the front line. You can be a trainee. You can be there on your first day. You might be facing complex situations. And you will only know what happens in these situations after the event. So in these particular circumstances, you need to work differently. You need to experiment. You need to try things out, see what works, and stop doing what doesn't. And we're not very good at stopping doing what doesn't work traditionally in health services. So at the best of times, this can feel hugely countercultural in the NHS with its traditional ethos of command and control. I sometimes hear it described as command without the control, but anyway, you get what I mean. And this links to the second reason why what's happening generally has implications for primary care. Because the way primary care works, as you well know, is very different from the secondary sector and the NHS at national level. It's mostly made up of independent small organisations, sometimes competing for business and resources. We had one person in a primary care network, a digital and transformation lead, and he said, and I quote, general practice is very diverse in the way it approaches things. Sometimes within the system, we're competing when we should be cooperating. We can't expect people to know how to interact with us when it's all run so differently. And the dispersed management structure in comparison to trusts and in comparison to integrated care boards, I think puts it at a real disadvantage in system-wide working. People who are in primary care cannot be there at all the meetings. You've got far more limited capacity. You can't be in the room where it happens for enough of the time. There's a real and understandable focus on hyperlocal issues, and this can be a huge advantage at local level. For example, we noticed how immediately primary care networks and community pharmacies came together at locality level to identify and try out new ways of joint working. For example, pharmacy consultations helping to reduce demand on GP services. But it means that primary care can struggle to gain positive relationships, and there's a need to rely on carrot rather than stick, because primary care is made up of many independent businesses rather than predominantly large-scale hierarchical and statutory public bodies. They have no recourse to the sanctions that can be applied in other parts of the system. So behaviours, especially diplomacy, persuasion, and the willingness to build common understanding are crucial. And at the same time, they need to navigate potentially contested territory with bodies that do have that statutory responsibility. So the local medical committee and the local pharmaceutical committee. And what this can mean is that primary care loses out in the battle for visibility and prioritisation, particularly in systems like Devon with big performance challenges. So in Devon, although both groups, the collaborative board and the networks themselves, all made the case for primary care. As one person put it, primary care is not the problem. Primary care is the solution. But both found it hard to get the message across, especially at a time when the acute sector is under such pressure and integrated care boards are under such financial pressure. Wanting to do something different can feel like a distraction. And it's also bound up sometimes with fear, not so much as change, but fear of loss. This is worth knowing about. People don't necessarily fear change, but they do fear loss, much more than they welcome gains. And yes, that can be loss of job, absolutely, stark as that. But quite often, it's about the change, the losses going on in people's heads. So loss of face, loss of control, loss of status, loss of the identity, especially professional identity, loss of certainty, loss of stability, loss of familiar ways of doing things. It is absolutely worth, as anyone working in primary care, for you to go out and have a coffee with somebody before you present your ideas and think about not the actual losses, but the stuff that might be going on in people's heads, the potential losses, and just then present your ideas in ways that show you've taken account of these potential losses. Not that you're going to solve them, just that you've recognized them. You can save yourselves inordinate amounts of time and bother by doing this. And you're not powerless in these situations. They're difficult, but there are things that you can do. There's a lot that you can do to give yourselves room for maneuver and to help tip the scales in your favor when so much is out of your control. Sometimes call it the God of small things. This is systems or adaptive leadership, ways of practicing leadership that have been developed precisely for these kinds of situations. It can be quite tempting, I think, if we're faced with something on a population health level, or we think we have to do something on a board level, or that we have to do something big, basically. I have to do something big and it has to be overnight, and then I'll wake up tomorrow and it will all be changed. System leadership says, actually, no. You're dealing with complexity here, so this is difficult stuff. Give yourselves a break. Don't do it on your own, and do something small and practical and doable for you. Start from where you are, go where the energy is, but do something. Found this in action. Start by working on relationships and thereby building trust, which will enable you to have influence wherever you are in the system, however much power you think you have or you don't have. It's not saying power dynamics don't exist, hierarchies don't exist. They absolutely do. They won't go away. But this is a way of parking them for a bit and just tipping the scales in your favor. If you've got relationships, if you've got trust, then you can have influence and you can move a system. So always see yourselves as being able to move things and change things. No system is immutable. And the only thing is, though, that, as we say here, systems move at the speed of trust. That is not my line, but I always use it because it's absolutely the case. Allow for what emerges. In other words, take a couple of steps, see what the situation is, and then decide what your next move should be, rather than saying, this is our plan stretching out, ad infinitum. And you are looking at distributed leadership here. In other words, you're not trying to command and control. You're saying that actually leadership is not about role or seniority. It's not synonymous with those things. Leadership is about actions and behaviors and enabling other people to take action. So everybody can do something. What they do will differ according to where they are, but everybody can do something. And this is the essence of leadership, as opposed to waiting for the leader somewhere up in the system or some deus ex machina to come along and tell us what to do. So there are things to focus on: action, relationships and trust, behaviors as part of this and underpinning relationships, and purpose. And I want to talk a little bit about relationships, behaviors, and purpose and what they can mean. So I want to start with relationships. And these are an absolutely key success factor for you. Now, you will notice that this example is not strictly to do with primary care. This is from the D-Day commemorations back in June and relates to David Lammy. But I use it for a specific purpose because I think it is absolutely germane for you. So David Lammy, at that time, Shadow Foreign Secretary. So not actual Foreign Secretary, Shadow Foreign Secretary, should not have been at the D-Day commemorations. However, had spent time developing relations with the Macron administration, tweeting in French, writing essays for intellectual Parisian magazines. In other words, building those relationships. It helped that the timing was right, so it wasn't far from the election date. So there is something about picking your moment here. Sorry, Mohit, you wanted to come in?
Just briefly to say, Debbie, we are running at past
Oh,
now.
right. I will take
So
another 5-10 minutes.
that'd be great.
That's
Thank you.
fine. That's fine. Yes, just to go back to this. First of all, the timing was right. So you might want to think about what is a good timing for you. And also notice the rules could be bent. The rules could change. So when you have relationships, things can move and move in other unexpected ways. So think about who you want to build the relationships with, the timing, and note that it will take time to do this. It's not going to happen overnight. The foundation of any relationship is reciprocal behaviors and making these explicit. Be very clear on this. Really talk about this, especially when you have history and baggage. I worked with one mental health trust that saw the acute trust as the enemy. That was their word. If you've got baggage, this is where you're starting from. And this is where they started from in Devon. With their permission, I'm quoting the rules of the house that they came up with. I won't go through all of them. You've got them here. But just notice we talked about willingness to build common understanding. And that's really what they were looking to do here, really listening to each other. The same happened with the primary care networks. What was interesting was how little people knew and how much people assumed. So it is really worth doing active listening and hearing and being willing to actually admit, I never knew that. And you do all these things to come to a shared purpose. This is crucial. Don't start with governance. Don't start with structure. Start with shared purpose. Not a mission statement, not something you write on a wall. A shared purpose is based on a coalition of the willing. Few people who think the way you do. 3 things. What is it we want to do? Why do we want to do it? The why is as important as the what. And what are the benefits going to be? This is your foundation. This is what enables you to keep the focus on your agenda and priorities. There will always be somebody else's agenda coming along in a moment, and you can get very practical as a result. So what are the experiments we want to try out? What are the indicators we might use? Who are the stakeholders we want to go after? Absolutely do this work first of all. It doesn't need to be about everything. It can be about some specific thing that you want to work on. Should not be more than 1 page. Absolutely needs to be in plain English. And if you do this, if you focus on relationships and behaviors and purpose, you can come out with some very different conversations and some much better outcomes. So in Devon, this was one example. There was work with a PCN and a community pharmacy leads. And Neil said, people keep saying to us, your numbers are incredible. How have you achieved this? And they had taken time to sit down together, work things through, come out with a purpose. And although this isn't primary care, the same had gone for Northamptonshire Council and Kettering Hospital, with the result that the council was now providing the space for blood tests for the NHS. Last year, they'd done something like 55,000 such tests. I want to touch very briefly on using your influence. When you've got your shared purpose in place, don't underestimate yourselves or what you bring. You've got the information, the relationships, the lie of the land, the credibility, the authority, and the authenticity. So absolutely use your influence. Be specific about who you want to influence. Do you want to influence them because they've got clout? Do you want to work with them because they share your values? And note, it's not always about just persuading and putting forward proposals and ideas. Sometimes it's about, through your shared purpose, getting people to pull as well. So you're not doing the exhausting work of pushing all the time. And then you can think about changing people's minds, the way they think about something. And this is about changing the frames in play. This was a headline from the Daily Mail last month. There's several frames here. So GPs putting patients at risk. So GPs as bad guys. And I use the word guys specifically because you see in this photo here, one, doctor is a man. Two, he's white. And C, he's wearing a white coat. I don't see any of those things as wholly about GPs. But frames are really powerful. They're about how we see people and organizations and sectors without even thinking about them. Often they're based in our values, they're based in emotions, they get continuously reinforced, but they are not immutable. And once a frame becomes accepted, a new frame becomes accepted, it becomes the new common sense. So if you can reframe an issue, you can get people to change their thinking. But start doing this before you get into the room and you need to make the arguments. Absolutely keep the argument on your territory. Don't get distracted. Don't get caught up in denial. If you just deny something, all you'll do is focus people's minds on what you don't want them to focus on. And think about who your messengers might be. Who are the people who can give that message for you? It doesn't need to be you. It might be a consultant in an acute trust, a matron, a counsellor, someone in a community. Think about who your messengers might be. Nor does it need to be one size fits all. We saw a lot of different models around the country of different forms of collaboratives, but they all emphasised, whether they were in an urban environment like Merton or a rural one like Herefordshire and Worcestershire, they all said trust is key, relationships matter. Once you've got that, you can have voice and influence, but that's where you need to start. And if anybody wants more information on these, please come back to me and I can give them. And I want to finish just by talking about the lessons learned from Devon and elsewhere. This is about reframing working with primary care as a privilege. It's not just some other thing. Primary care has unique value here. It's very different to working with other parts of the NHS. So the managers in the NHS who are trained in the old system, this is a new world. The skills and behaviours required are different. And you need to work with the grain of primary care. It's not the NHS in miniature. Primary care leaders need to work differently and need high-level leadership skills to do this. But absolutely start with making connections and building relationships. This builds trust, and trust can lead to outcomes even when resources are constrained. We've already seen change happen. Primary care in Devon is achieving much with limited resources, and it could achieve more still with continued emphasis on relationship building, networking, and testing and redrawing the boundaries within the system. So the stakes are high. There's real opportunity here to engage with primary care in the process of change, to get more collaboration, build communities and build the benefits of integrations with local populations. One of the people in Devon said, the opportunity is there. That's why I'm involved. And I think the
Oh,
same would probably go
fabulous.
for all of us.
How
I'll stop
fabulous.
there. Thank you very
I
much.
think I think it's mind blowing what you've shared, Debbie, because it was a real masterclass in building relationships and trust. And often that's not the position where we start from. The
Yeah.
starting point is this is what my contract says, this is what my job is, and this is my role. And if we build from a different place, and I absolutely love the parlance about don't start a conversation, go out for a coffee.
Yeah,
So you know where the
absolutely.
other person's starting from, and it helps you reset how you reframe the conversation. There's joint recognized endeavors. And I absolutely loved it. I think some
Thank
of
you.
what you said today applies in so many different areas, but more so in primary care, because you're spot on that the resources and leadership capabilities that have been provided to primary care are marginalized by the number of other things that happen. Now, there are some questions that are popping in, and a very old and dear friend of mine, Caroline, has posted a question around the role of voluntary sector and building that relationship. And I think rather than go into the details of the question, it's a really good question around, so how do you build that relationship of trust so that actually there is work that the voluntary sector does, which is recognized. And Debbie, you've been the chair and the board member of trustee of so many amazing voluntary sector partners who are internationally renowned, not just nationally renowned. So how do you see when you talk about primary care in Devon? Did this work extend to primary care as in truly outside hospital, or did it come to primary care as in doctors, nurses, pharmacists, dentists?
It was mainly because they asked for this, doctors, nurses, managers, and pharmacists. We didn't get round to dentists and optometrists and others. But the key thing about Devon, as it is in other rural or other communities, is the role of the VCSE. And I think the key thing for primary care is to form alliances, real alliances with the VCSE, because it has been noted that there are real commonalities here. A lot of people on the VCSE, particularly chief execs, have been asked to join various place-based groups or boards that have been set up by the integrated care system or the integrated care board with the best of intentions. But I think there is sometimes an assumption that voluntary sector chief execs get paid for turning up at all these extra meetings, and they have people to slot in, and somehow the voluntary sector is also the NHS in miniature, and this is absolutely not the case. So just as primary care might start thinking about what is our shared purpose here? What is it we really want to do and why? Could you join forces with the VCSE and think, what is it we want to do as a group? And then that gives you that extra resource to actually be part of the system and have a louder voice, is how I would describe it.
Phenomenal. And I think it's you're so right when you talk about having power and influence is not about position.
No. Mhm.
It's about the relationships you build in, and hopefully that gives assurance to Caroline about the opportunities that exist. But there are a couple of really good comments in the Q&A, and they kind of link in. One of them is around, I mean, Jamu, who's a really old friend and one of those amazing people who's inspired me. She chairs the PPG at her practice and has actually initiated the PPG. She was telling me after one of the conversations we had at these webinars. And what's really amazing is she's talking about sharing your slides with wider people,
Please
talk
do.
about
Please
leadership.
do.
But there's another question that links in, which talks about how do you develop that shared purpose? What did you do to develop a shared purpose? Because you were spot when you started by saying put time and effort into the shared purpose rather than the how and what we will do, and this is my position and my power. What did you do that made
Mhm.
people come together to
Mhm.
honestly have a conversation
Mhm.
about agnostic of what it is today to what can tomorrow be
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
own it so that each
Mm.
of them were vested in that future
Yes.
becoming a reality?
Yeah.
What did you do about that,
I
Debbie?
think it's horses for courses. So with the collaborative board, we didn't start with purpose. We started with behaviours and actually took time to talk to people individually in advance. You know, what's your view? Where are you coming from? Fed some of that back and then said, in the light of this, how do we want to behave? So that people could actually have a proper, honest conversation with each other. And once we had that, then we could start to think about what's the shared purpose here. And that coalesced around sort of 5 key areas. With the primary care networks in the localities, it was really interesting because it was a bigger group. It was about between 50 and 60 people who came together, and people worked in localities. And quite honestly, sometimes just let people try it out. Say about this particular thing or about this thing that you identify, what is it you want to do? Why do you want to do it? What are the benefits going to be? You're not looking for something that's perfect or set in stone. You're just looking for something enough to start with. Good enough to start with is absolutely fine. And then you can tweak it as you go along, as you should, because circumstances will change. But sometimes you don't need a huge build-up. Just giving people the opportunity to think about a conversation about something that is really new to a lot of people. It really, ooh, we haven't had this before. We've always had a strategy that we've pointed to vaguely. This is actually getting people to think, what is it you want to do here? So it's about giving people a sense of agency as well, I think, when it can be hard to actually see that in the plethora of demands that come through.
Absolutely. And I think that was beautifully said. And and people get so caught up, you get so caught up in this strategy and the plethora of demand that you sometimes don't see the wood from the trees.
Mm,
And it needs people to take a step back.
yes.
And having someone like you facilitate that
Mhm,
position
mhm.
brings an immense amount of power
Yeah.
to what the room can together do
Mm,
rather than what individuals can deliver. And I think
absolutely.
it stood out to me today when I went to the acute hospital, and I had I kid you not, I came back so proud to think
Mm,
I work
mm,
in this system.
yeah.
Every one of them made me feel proud.
Mm, mm,
That said, you do come back and think they are individually amazing institutions rather than
mm,
collectively harnessing and unleashing their power, which could be much more. And hearing the Devon story, which you shared around how, despite the resource constraint,
mm.
actually they've improved
Do
care.
something. Yeah,
And
you
you
can
kind of
do
sit
things.
back and think, because we automatically assume, well, money's gone tight, so we can't deliver good care. But actually, primary care stepped up to the mark.
Mm,
And that was all based on developing trust together
yes,
so that
yeah,
people had the same vision, the
yeah.
same value set, and could think about it together.
It's
I
always
think,
the unexpected conversations that are the most rewarding, and just asking the questions rather than say, this is what I'm assuming about you. Is it actually the case that?
and there's a question from someone around. Often our starting point is a top down, and you've got senior leaders. I mean, you spoke about it very eloquently at the start, and I'm not sure I would do it justice if I even try quoting what you said. But what was really interesting in one of the questions that's popped in from a colleague, they're talking about how do you engender a level of bottom up of ideas. I
Mhm,
mean, you've got
mhm,
BCSE colleagues who can deliver something. It's the personal influence they have on exactly the same people. You've got carers in the community. There's a question around marginalized groups, which are
mhm,
often mothers or people
mhm,
from
mhm,
ethnic backgrounds or people with
mhm,
disabilities. How do you harness the power of those
mhm,
groups
mhm.
so that they can come to the forefront and paint the picture of what a future could look like, so that there was something the leaders had in their sight of what would
Yeah.
be the identified
Mhm,
outcomes they're looking for.
mhm. I think there's two things. One is go and talk to people, absolutely, and um, please don't never use the phrase hard to reach. Okay, they're not hard to reach. You just haven't found them yet. You don't need to start with absolutely everybody either. Just one or two people. So who are the really connected people in a place? Who are the influencers? They won't necessarily have a job title, but you will know, or people will know who they are. To just mention a couple of other things in this regard. There is an approach called empathy mapping. It might be familiar to some people on the call. And it's just a way, not necessarily of putting yourself in other people's shoes, which I always think is a bit sort of dicey anyway, but it's a way of getting a group of people to recognize their collective impact on others, particularly other marginalized people, um, as a system. So it gets away from blame. It gets away from finger pointing. It gets people to think of themselves as a system. So get a group of people in a room, physically, face to face, don't do this on Teams, physically in a room. You ask them to imagine someone. Doesn't matter who the person is, as long as they matter to them. And then you ask them the question, what is it like for uh, for this person to be on the receiving end of us as a system, collectively? What does the person see, hear? How do they experience us? What do they see and hear? What do they think and feel? And what do they do? And what do they expect? It's a really good kind of pre-work just to get yourself in that space. And I just wanted finally to return to the top-down point, because this is very, very common. This is absolutely the culture of the NHS. But just sometimes the dial shifts and the balance of power shifts. Um, and Andy Cowper has written recently one of his health policy insights, which I would really recommend. He says, quote, NHS England is too preoccupied, too option-free to sack NHS Trust chief executives, and no one wants their jobs. So you're seeing Trust CEOs being a little more vocal, for example, about the financial situations. Sometimes it's just a matter of thinking, I've got some space to do something here. I'm going to take it, whilst that opportunity is there, and go for it. See how far you get. I always say proceed until apprehended.
Absolutely. And there's a really good comment from John, which talks about talk to your PPGs, talk to
Yeah,
your patient participation groups, because they
absolutely.
know it, they're
Hotspots, your
experiencing it.
people. Yeah.
They are the experts who are actually at the receiving end of
Mm,
this system.
yeah.
And sometimes, with the best of intentions, we don't get that right.
Mhm.
And actually, they'll be very helpful in such cases to help us set it right and
Absolutely.
focus on things that
Yeah.
genuinely matter to people.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think
It
there's
won't
there's
cost
another thing.
money either.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's another thing you raised, Debbie, which was I found it really insightful. It was around behaviors. And I wanted to understand from you, colleagues in different parts of the system, in a well-intentioned way, often behave in ways that doesn't help a
Mm,
system view of
mm,
working together.
mm.
And it happens in primary care, it happens in secondary care, it happens in the community and voluntary sector, it happens in the dental sector, and often there's a lot of finger pointing. What did you do to
Um,
help people behave differently? Because
mhm,
it sets the tone so differently when your behavior is not quite there.
mm, mm. I think it helps if you're coming in from outside, because it's more legitimate somehow to say, this is what we found. I should say other facilitators are available, but seriously, it does help to have somebody from outside. And there is something about holding the mirror up to people. People want to do a good job. People are not in the NHS because they want to be pantomime villains. But that sometimes they have got inured to ways of working, or they're always looking over their shoulders, and giving people the opportunity to say, no, actually, I want to sign up for something else. That said, you do get people who just really like being obnoxious, and that know those people. Always start with people who share your values. Never start with people who don't. There might be messengers who can help that person change. And sometimes you've just got to wait for somebody else to come along. But I think what we found was that there was enough common cause there to actually start making progress, not to solve everything, but just to start.
Absolutely. And I absolutely loved it when you said, don't worry about changing the whole system. Just pick up the nidus where you
Yeah.
think you can. And then people gravitate towards success, isn't it? You just need
Mm.
the first successful idea to work
Yeah.
out for others to say,
Yes.
actually, I want to be part of that success. I
Yeah.
want to make a difference myself.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, I have never met a clinician. And when I say clinician, I am using the broadest term for absolutely everyone who works in the clinical services. I have never met anyone who genuinely doesn't want to make a difference.
Yeah.
Someone who
Absolutely.
genuinely doesn't want to come together and say, you know what, I am here to make a difference today.
Mhm.
And I'd love to see someone walk out with a smile.
Yeah.
Everyone does.
Mm.
And I think that's what drives us. I
Yeah.
think, Debbie, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so it'll not be enough time to ask a question. But I have to say, I've had the joy of having so many people on this webinar who have left their mark. They have really have left their mark. You named a few, but I can name so many people who have headed IT companies who have done things in primary care, people who have worked in the system, Royal College professors. And I have to say, I mean, some of the things you said was incredibly inspiring today, incredibly inspiring. And it showed the power that could be unleashed by primary
Mm.
care. It showed how
Absolutely.
they could actually
Mm.
be on the center stage and grab that scene. But it's about reimagining that approach we take in primary care often without seeing it from a perspective of primary care alone, but from all partners and getting a feel of that
Yeah.
without just approaching it from one perspective.
Mm.
And I think there was some amazing terms you used, which I liked a lot about. The bit I really liked was the wider determinants of health, recognizing
Mhm.
it is
Mhm.
that's what is the complexity.
Yeah.
That's what we are trying
Mm.
to tackle. Because together, until we tackle that, actually what we are seeing on the front of primary care at the footfall is not going to change. There is
Yeah.
absolutely
No.
nothing.
Mhm.
There was something really nice when you spoke about stop doing things that don't matter,
Mhm.
because we don't. We're not very good
Mhm.
at it.
Mhm.
We do continue. I mean, I don't know how many times we add a new process without thinking, what can we stop because it's a duplicate? And
Mhm.
we don't. So
Mhm.
stopping doing that reduces waste in the system. It reduces the time we are wasting and
Mhm.
also gives us back time and resilience to do something new and better
Right.
and more
Yes.
innovative, which
Mhm.
there is no one better than
Mhm.
the end user, the service user, the patient, and the GP and the primary care clinical staff
Mhm.
who know the right answer to this. I love the phrase God of small things. I think I'm going to steal that and use
Mhm.
it again at
Yes,
another
please
point
do.
in my life. I'm
Not
sure
mine,
I
I
will.
should say.
it was lovely to hear that.
Thank you.
And I think I also love the bit about knowing versus assuming.
Mm,
It's a lot about don't assume things,
yeah,
check for it, and then
absolutely. That's
try
right.
out new things without
Yeah,
assuming there is nothing. It was a
yeah,
lot of positivity which you
yeah,
shared today,
yeah.
which I absolutely loved. And I'm sure what you demonstrated, what you've done in Devon, is not going to make a difference in the first few years, but as
Mhm.
this builds up and
Thank
ramps
you.
up,
Yeah.
generations in
Mm,
Devon will be thankful for the work you've done there. And
thank you.
hopefully, today's conversation would allow many of the other colleagues who are engaged today to do something similar and make an inspiring difference to what our residents, our communities will
Mhm.
aspire to, will get from us, and deserve richly. They
Mm,
really
mm,
deserve it from us.
mm. And we
So I
can do
think
it.
a
Primary care
very,
can
very
absolutely
big
do
thank
this.
you for
My
helping
pleasure.
us reimagine power between primary and secondary care colleagues and how we can make that difference. Now, I would be absolutely dismayed to say this is Kelsey's last webinar supporting us. So a very, very big thank you to Kelsey and a big thank you to Mandy who's joined her today, because without what they have done in the background, this wonderful polished thing doesn't come in the forefront. I mean, they are just amazing, making sure things happen. People know what's happening, invites go out. So thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, Mandy, for joining us. A very, very big thank you to the 500 odd people. I mean, last one, there were 1,000 people who watched those webinars. And you rock. You really rock. Colleagues, without you, there is nothing. You keep it so active. You add things, you ask questions, you keep it dynamic, and you make it joyful to be on this webinar merely by knowing that 1,000 of you actually value what's being sent and participate and take an active interest, are on so many platforms, and the downloads are viewed so often. Thank you. Please use the QR codes that are shared on the screen so that you can post your feedback on that, so that we can continue to make this worthwhile for you. And hopefully it'll be 2000 sometime watching this webinar. Wishing you all an absolutely amazing afternoon. Thank you for joining.